Good evening, everyone. My name is Stephen Woolfolk. I'm the Director of Programming and Marketing for the Kansas City Public Library, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight to welcome you for this final installment in our Turning Point series with our good friends at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. Tonight marks the final program in this series, but as I mentioned last time, we're actively working through some ideas for what comes next. We have some great thoughts, and I think that we'll real soon have some idea of where we're going to go next with our next great series. But tonight we turn our attention to Cold War historian Sean Kalic. He joins us to look back at the Soviet Union's successful launch of Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite placed in space. Sputnik fell from orbit just months after it was launched, but it intensified the arms race, heightened the Cold War, and many of those concerns about the militarization and the weaponization of space continue to be talked about to this day. Sean Kalic is a historian and a professor in the Department of Military History at the college. He earned his doctorate in history from Kansas State University and is the author of 7 books, including U.S. Presidents and the Militarization of Space, 1945 to 1967. He's also a veteran of this partnership, presenting, I believe, 5 times in the last 7 years. Please welcome back to the Kansas City Public Library, Dr. Sean Kalic.
Thank you. Tonight we're going to talk about Sputnik and the race to control space. And we'll talk about the space race. We'll talk about this idea of space becoming a military domain, which is a hot topic in the military right now. That space, besides land, sea, and air, we now have space and cyber, and that'll come up as part of the discussion. So we'll start off around 1945, and we're going to take it till about 1960, 1961, and we'll kind of end it there because I only have 45 minutes to talk, and I want to give you a chance to ask questions and everything. So we'll start at 45 and kind of move on. And I know the theme of this is turning points. And what I'm going to make the argument is that Sputnik, yes, it's a turning point, but it's also a catalyst. And it's a catalyst to emphasize and significantly militarize space. And I'll make a difference between militarized space and weaponized space. We'll talk about that as we go through, because the U.S. government is going to make a really hard line on that we can militarize space, but we can't weaponize it, and we're going to hold fast and true to that. From 67 on. So we'll kind of work through really how we kind of evolve up to the Sputnik moment, and then what Sputnik does for the U.S. space program, and we'll talk a little bit about the Soviet space program as well, okay? Sounds like a plan? 40 minutes, we're good to go, right? All right, let's start in 1945 in the immediate period after the Second World War, all right? So the V-2 rocket is part of this discussion and process too, because as we know, as the war ends, there's this thing called Operation Paperclip going on in Germany, where U.S. and British scientists are scurrying around the countryside, gobbling up as many rocket parts and advanced aeronautical parts that they can, and engineers too, by the way, which is how we end up with Wernher von Braun and a bunch of his crew, right? And this idea about going to space, it really starts prior to the Second World War, but the Second World War and rockets really energizes the idea after the war, with this idea that really research and development helps drive the U.S. to victory. In fact, Hap Arnold, the leader of the Army Air Corps, Army Air Forces, is going to make the point right after the war that one of the main elements that led to our victory was this relationship with universities and what become think tanks, that allowed civilian scientists and engineers and researchers to push the ideas forward. Radar, right? Rockets, infrared, all kinds of advanced technology that you can weaponize and use for a decisive effect. And he wants to ensure that this relationship doesn't stop when the war ends, and that it continues to give us this really technological base that we can maintain and leverage as we go to war against the Soviet Union, first and foremost. So rockets, I would argue, are the beginnings of this. But the problem is the V-2 rocket is relatively small as rockets go that we'll come to see. It doesn't have a whole lot of lift. So the idea that this is kind of physics, right? It's really a thrust-to-weight ratio problem. You have to have enough thrust to get all of that up in the air and then do a ballistic trajectory and then down. And the problem that they have in Germany specifically is how do you generate enough thrust to get it up in the air and on its way? And the problem is you can do that with a light-skinned vehicle, but if you start putting things on top of it, it gets very top-heavy, they start to fall over. Then you need gyroscopes and or guidance systems that make it 10 times heavier, so now it's you're throwing your whole system off. So really, rockets become the crux of this idea. So in 1945, in October 45, Commander Harvey Hall, who is one of the Bureau of Aeronautics naval officers, and he has this proposal that the Navy should think about possibly building and getting into space. Not a bad idea, right? If you're in the sea service, space is kind of like this, like the sea, but higher, right? At least Star Trek and all that stuff, right? They use the same. So Harvey Hall has this proposal. Let's start a program that starts thinking about how would you engineer a satellite on top of a new rocket, and they're going to use German V2s with some additions to them. And then what would you use the satellite for? The problem is the Navy doesn't have a whole lot of money. In fact, Harvey Hall is going to make the point that the cost of this system is going to be between $5 and $8 million. This is October 1945, right? And the Navy says, sorry, we don't have that kind of money laying around. So he has this brilliant idea that if we don't have the money, who can we partner up with that would have the money, that may be interested in space? And the answer is the Army Air Force. And the guy in charge of research and development is none other than Curtis LeMay. You may have heard his name once or twice before, right? The guy who's going to end up running Strategic Air Command, who runs the 8th Air Force for a while, then goes over in the Pacific and runs the Air Forces over there. LeMay's response, which is going to come from Harvey Hall around December, February of 46, is why is the Navy interested in space? He has no interest in partnering with the Navy. In fact, he is tried and true committed to the Air Force, and he wants to know specifically, this is our domain, right? If we operate in the air, space is just an extension of the air. So it should be our program, not the Navy's program. So his letter back to Harvey Hall is essentially, thank you, but no thanks. We'll go our own way. And what LeMay does is he quickly turns to the Douglas Aircraft Corporation in California and says, can you put together a feasibility study for me for if we can build, develop, and design a satellite? And the Douglas Aircraft Corporation, which is known for building airplanes, has a small research and development organization within it, which becomes, you may know it as the RAND Corporation, Research and Development, R&D, right? That's how RAND gets its name. And they say, absolutely sure. So LeMay pays them, I think it's $1 million contract for the very first development of a feasibility study. Number one, is it feasible? What will you use it for? And then can it change the nature of the way we think about using space and or warfare with high tech? And up on the other screen is the preliminary report, which comes out in May of 1946. And it's a really interesting report to read as we sit here today in 2024, right? And the fact that it says things like satellites are inherently different than other weapon systems, and that they don't kill people and they don't kill things. And if you think about it, they can do both probably, right? But in 1946, space is this brand new frontier that no one's really spent a whole lot of time thinking about, except some sci-fi writers and things like that. And these engineers and scientists are going to make the point that the biggest benefit for developing a satellite would be prestige in the new Cold War. That if you can show the world that you have this awesome technology, the science, the research, the engineering to build a satellite, put it into space, and let it orbit the Earth, everyone will want to be your friend. Right? And if you think about the early Cold War, it really is about we can't meet the Soviets mano a mano on the battlefield, but if we can demonstrate to the world that we have these capabilities that we can use to leverage for not just peaceful purposes, but also scientific purposes, that this prestige will be a major factor, which I would argue is one of the fundamental tenets of how we come to think about space as a military domain, that it's inherently somewhat different in the fact that it really has scientific and kind of frontier-like benefits. Now, one of the other kind of interesting comical parts of reading this is that it says things like, well, you can't use satellites as bombers because if you drop a bomb in space, it just floats away. Which always makes me kind of chuckle because here you have the best minds in the world who simply don't understand that if you just put some thrust on it, you can make it deorbit. But the reality is, it's a brand new field of study, right? So you see these guys kind of scratching their heads saying, oh, if you can drop it, it'll just float away, which is kind of comical when you read it today. Now, the other important element of this preliminary design, this think piece, is that they identify 4 main missions that maybe satellites can be used. The first one is communications, which is relatively easy. Second one is intelligence gathering, and there's kind of 2 branches off that. You can do photo interpretation or photo collection, and you can do maybe electronic collection, so like radar, which is relatively new. Then they argue that weather is another important element that you can use here. And if you think about who's paying for the report, the Air Force, just coming out of war and conducting these massive bombing campaigns, those kind of synchronize pretty well with the ideas of what the Air Force may need if and when they have to prosecute an atomic war or a conventional war against the Soviet Union. You need communication, right? You need real-time or pretty good weather intelligence on the target. You also need a bomb damage assessment or targets. If you don't know where targets are in the Soviet Union, having a satellite flying over taking pictures would be fantastic, right? Because the Soviet Union is a closed society, and we have a really hard time getting intelligence from the Soviet Union, really, I would argue, from 1945 up to the duration of the Cold War. So this report really is the beginning that, yes, number one, it is feasible. Number two, it's a unique weapon system. And they kind of steer away from the idea of a weapon system in this report, and they just call it a system, and that it doesn't kill things. It's really going to be used for other kind of non-weaponized-like systems. And that becomes the foundation for, really is going to be, during the Truman administration, it becomes a feasibility study and an obsession with if and when and how can you use this. The Eisenhower administration is really known as the beginning of the space race for most folks, right? I make the argument that this is really the beginning of the space race, because that prestige point that they make in it, that if the first nation that does this is going to be the benefit of this whirlwind discussion about science and technology, and that the American, I would argue, the American presidents from Truman through Eisenhower specifically, and then even Kennedy and Johnson, have this idea that if America can be this beacon of science and technology, right, education, leadership, that it can carry a lot more sway in the world than just building weapon systems, right? You can build tanks, great, but if you demonstrate that you have this other capability and you use it for good, and the phrase that they keep using is for the benefit of all mankind, that it will, naturally demonstrate that we are better than the Soviet Union, okay? So that's the beginning of the space race, right? And we can talk about that if you have questions. But these two guys are the ones who kind of, I would argue, generate the beginning of this discussion. I guess this goes, oh, there we go. Now the next three gentlemen, right? We have two more Rand folks and then Charles Cabell, which I'll talk about. So the first report is in 46. Throughout 46 through 50, the Rand Corporation is going to do a whole series of internal conferences and other papers paid for by the Air Force about satellites and space. And the two main gentlemen that propelled this idea is Louis Ridnour and then Frank Colboom. Frank Colboom is the founder of RAND. He's an engineer, he's a test pilot, and he's been working with the Douglas Corporation since the 1920s. So he's kind of been around a little bit. And what they focus on is the second major paper out of RAND after that first one is dealing with the psychology of weapon systems. Satellites figure heavily into this, and they have an internal discussion within. They're talking about atomic weapons and all these things. And the last day, they discuss satellites and what impact a satellite will make. And this is both Ridnour and Colboom, and they make a specific point that satellites, again, provide a psychological impact on not just your opponent, but also the world. So there's a deterrent value to it that you can demonstrate to your enemy that if you can build this fantastic new machine, this system that can do either gather photos or demonstrate, what weather is somewhere around the world and just orbit around the globe, that you have a technological capability that they don't know about, and therefore they should be aware. But they also spin off that same idea about the positive psychological benefit. That if you use this for good and you confine it to communication systems or photographic intelligence, right, or weather, or any other idea that you can think of that is non-weaponized, that you can demonstrate to the world that you're about preserving this new scientific frontier. And that's the phrase they keep using with for the benefit of all mankind and new scientific frontier. That it really is about exploring and not controlling it, and we'll talk about how that comes to be in a little bit, but the idea is preserving it as an open frontier for all, which is somewhat different from how they're going to depict the Soviets as doing it. So I would argue that through the first 4 or 5 years of this space race, RAND is really driving these ideas at the benefit of the Air Force. And if you look at it, their ideas is that you can use satellites for those 5 missions up there, right? So communication, which we already talked about, and when we get to Eisenhower, we'll talk about passive and active communication satellites. So there's a passive one that looks like a big silver ball, by the way, and another one that's a repeater that you send a message to, it takes the message and then repeats it and then sends it back. Reconnaissance, because one of the driving issues in the early Cold War, I would argue for the duration of the Cold War actually, is how do we know what the Soviets have, right? And if we talk about the strategic nuclear balance, right, because the Soviets surprise us and test their first bomb in 49, and it shocks the US simply because we think they're going to get the bomb around 55. And this helps propel the ideas that if you have something that can orbit the Earth and give you real-time intelligence and data on what they have, what they're testing, it can help stabilize that balance. And that's one of the driving forces, I would argue, for Eisenhower, is the need to know. Because at the same time, we're flying ferreting flights around the Soviet Union trying to figure out where their radar systems are, what their anti-aircraft systems are like, and we lose some aircraft and people, by the way. And the idea from these scientists is that you can put something high enough and in space that can't be reached, therefore you don't have to worry about losing crews. And then you'll always know as well. Navigation's another one, and this is going to be, how many of you used GPS to get here today? It starts in this era, right? Again, they identified it in 1946. They really start playing with the idea in 48, and by 1950 they're going to be working on a system called transit, which we'll talk about during the Eisenhower administration. The idea that if you have aircraft or ships, that they can use satellite navigation as a better means to kind of get where they're going, okay? Targeting, that's an easy one. Again, you don't have good maps in the Soviet Union, but if you have something in space that can fly over and take pictures, now you have awesome real-life photos that you can now identify targets, and then ultimately intelligence collection. And I would argue that part of intelligence collection is also weather as well. So here are the scientists doing this, right? Charles Cabell, who is actually the director of Air Force Intelligence, is going to read these reports, and he likes the idea, but he's going to push the idea even further up the Air Force chain. And says, I know you guys are building Strategic Air Command. I know we're working on long-range ballistic missiles. I know we're working on long-range bombers, but we have to start thinking about space. And the idea isn't really developed yet, but the idea of air and space as one continuous operational medium. They're going to come to call it aerospace in 1958. But Cabell's already thinking about that idea in really the early 50s, like 50, 51, 52, right? And he comes up with the idea that the Air Force can really specifically use and develop satellites for, number one, prompt bomb damage assessment, right? So if you can use all those ideas for RAND, you can also use it for if you have to strike a target in the Soviet Union. Now we don't have any way to kind of fly over it because it's the Soviet Union. They have lots of anti-aircraft guns, and you lose all kinds of aircraft and crew. But if you have a satellite, you can take instantaneous pictures, send those back, and now you have good hard intelligence on what your damage or what your raids did, and if you have to strike them again. The second one is weather. The Air Force is obsessed with weather. I wonder why, right? And it's something you tend not to think about, right? That if you're flying operational missions in an air campaign, you need not only weather on where your base is, but you also need good, accurate weather over the target. And one of the problems that the Air Force has is they don't have a good, reliable way, besides balloons, of getting weather data over the Soviet Union. The problem with balloons is they kind of go where the wind's pushing them. So they want an idea of how you can get better target or weather over the target, and Colburn's going to say satellites are the best means for that. And then that sinks back into the idea of targeting, that if you don't have good intel on what the Soviet Union's building, where their factories are, where their air bases are, where their submarine pens are, a satellite can give you that information. Because one of the things driving the United States Air Force in this early period of the Cold War is the Soviet Union has built up a robust anti-aircraft defense system. And what we learned from the Second World War is that bombing offensives take significant tolls on bombers and crew, like about a 30% attrition rate, by the way. So if there's a way you can reduce that by using satellites, the Air Force is all in. So I would argue that by 1952, what you have is you have two streams developing. You have kind of the civilian scientists saying, here's what satellites can do, and they can give you awesome prestige and benefits around the globe. And the Air Force is saying, great, awesome, and now we can fine-tune that into specific needs that the Air Force has if and when we have to conduct a strategic bombing campaign against the Soviet Union. And this all happens within the Truman administration. This is why I make the argument that the space race doesn't start with Sputnik and Eisenhower. The space race has already started with that first idea about satellites and that first RAND report in 46. that we're already thinking about how to use space as this operational medium to allow us to gather goods, prompt intelligence, and information on the Soviet Union, which we're locked in this Cold War with. All right, now everyone's favorite, Eisenhower, right? So what happened during the Truman administration is that essentially the Air Force and the RAND Corporation are really pushing these ideas. And the Navy's involved a little bit, the Army becomes a little bit involved because after all, their scientists are the ones that build the rockets, right? And really the biggest problem in the early stage prior to Eisenhower is that thrust to weight ratio I talked about. Remember that V2 I showed, right? It doesn't have a whole lot of thrust, and they kind of work with Army engineers and Navy engineers and some Air Force engineers are trying to make more thrust, and the problem is they keep exploding. So the idea is you need to get a bigger rocket that can handle the size of satellites because we're still on the verge of microelectronics. So the idea is that satellites tend to be kind of big, right? If you want them to do cool things like take pictures and beam things back to Earth, and the idea that if you can develop microelectronics, which are going to evolve based upon atomic and nuclear weapons, now you can start miniaturizing them and then maybe using better rockets. This all comes home to roost in NSC 5520, this U.S. satellite program, which is one of the first National Security Council documents of the Eisenhower administration. The first one is 162/2, which talks about maintaining an advantage in the Cold War and using this thing called a strategic offset, right? Which a strategic offset is if you can't match the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact and conventional forces, you use technology as an offset to get more bang for the buck. The idea is that if you can leverage technology, can you leverage space as well, which is how NSC 5520 comes into play. And it focuses on the U.S. satellite program. Now, the Eisenhower administration is unique in the fact that you have some different tensions and ideas going on here. And we'll start with the Dulles brothers, and then we'll come back to Eisenhower. Because Eisenhower has a very unique way of thinking about this long game. In fact, Eisenhower does not like racing the Soviet Union. I'll talk about him at the end with Kennedy, too. He's about ensuring that the United States maintains its economic power and doesn't frivolously waste its money on dead-end projects. So this idea of racing just because the guy's getting ahead of you is something that Eisenhower can never quite understand. And we'll talk about how Sputnik gets revolved into that because it's kind of comical the way he reacts, which is kind of deadpan, by the way. However, the other two guys on the screen, John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State, and his brother Alan Welsh Dulles, Director of Central Intelligence, believe that if you can leverage space, you have that psychological component that you can now leverage over the Soviet Union and put a lot of pressure on them. And if you're thinking about space, guess who else is thinking about space? Soviet Union, right? The Dulles brothers are abject anti-communists, like they hate communists. And they're almost to the point of paranoia, by the way. And they're like, if you don't weaponize space and control space, Soviets are going to do it. And then this whole discussion of fear of a red moon is going to start evolving, right? Which is going to drive the Air Force, because the Air Force, right, is going to make the point that space is part of that continuous operational domain, right? And what's one of the main axioms that you learn in any military operation is control the high ground, right? So the Dulles brothers with the Air Force are going to come up with this idea that space is the ultimate high ground. That if you can control space, you can have significant impact on your enemy. Now that's a little different from what Rand was talking about in the Air Force, but the idea is that what we start seeing happening in the Eisenhower administration is the movement from militarization of space and feasibility ideas to now playing with ideas of weaponization. Eisenhower's going to say, no, I don't want any of that. And he keeps saying it, but we'll talk about how he codifies it later. But the idea is that he thinks we can get more bang for our buck if we play a more pacific idea. That if we say space is really about preserving that frontier for the benefit of all mankind. And we can partner with other scientific nations and use the idea, right? Now again, he's going to be all about this idea of militarization, not weaponization, which is where he's going to draw that fine line. Militarization is you can use space for military purposes. Remember communication we talked about, navigation, photo reconnaissance. Anything that doesn't have physical weapon systems in it is okay as part of militarization. So when you start basing weapons in space or dropping tungsten rods from space to hit targets, that's weaponization, which Eisenhower believes is not for the benefit of the United States, which is good, all right? Now, also part of this NSC 5520 is, again, international prestige. You can see the year 55, so we're not that far off from Sputnik, right? So we're 2 years away from Sputnik at this point. but we're already thinking about how to build these programs, right? And the idea about prestige, in doing my research, prestige shows up in almost every document you see. The U.S. is going to gain this great prestige. And from 46 up through 57, that is, I would argue, a truth that America believes is going to happen, that we are going to be the first nation in space with this artificial satellite, and we're going to have all these great accolades, and it's just going to be awesome, and we're going to win the Cold War. We kind of know how that ends, sort of, right? And that is linked to the technological and scientific superiority. Now, the other thing they do here, and this is Eisenhower and some of his scientists, this International Geophysical Year, the IGY, that if you really want to benefit and play this idea, and I shouldn't say play because they mean it, that you make this new year, 1957, as an international, right, geophysical year, where all nations get together and pitch brand new scientific ideas. It's a forum for science and research for nations that come together as one. Again, playing on that idea of using space for peaceful purposes, not a frontier. And the Vanguard satellite program is going to be part of that, and that's Vanguard down there. It's going to be this little satellite, right, that's no bigger than really a basketball, and it's going to have limited capabilities. And if we can put this satellite up with civilian rockets. Now, what's interesting is that Eisenhower is all about maintaining this split between military and civilian. But the problem is there's only one group of people working on rockets in the U.S. in the early 1950s, and it's the military. So essentially this idea of you don't want to use military rockets, so what you have to do is go to the rocket manufacturer and scrub off U.S. Air Force and put in USA on it, and then you're like, okay, it's a civilian rocket, wink, wink, right? The reality is they're the same rockets. And I'll show some pictures that the early ICBMs actually becoming booster rockets for NASA and all that fun stuff later as well. But Eisenhower's going to begin this idea of moving this split between military and civilian, which the Air Force isn't necessarily in favor of, because again, remember that axiom, control the high ground. And they're what you see in National Security Council meetings is Air Force representatives that show up will continually pound Eisenhower about, you can't lose this fight. That if you lose space and you can't control space, we're doomed to live under a red moon. Again, they keep using the same phraseology over and over again. Red moon, international prestige. And John Foster Dulles and Alan Walsh Dulles are actually big proponents of that idea. The Air Force is coming up with different ideas, though. They come up with this Weapon System 117L, which is really a whole host of programs. And what happens is the Air Force has a development command called the Air Research Development Command, which is out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and then it's going to get spread across the United States. But also as part of that Air Force, or Air Research Development Command, ARDC, there's another branch called the Western Development Division, which again, none of this sounds very military-like, by the way, right? And the Western Development Division is actually going to be based out in Los Angeles, California. And its head's going to be Colonel Bernard Schriever, right? And his expertise is engineering and science. He's going to end up building rockets. But part of their program in that Western Development Division is going to be this WS-117L and this obsession with militarizing space. So remember General Cabell early on, who came up with those ideas from the intelligence side? Schriever's, one of his tasks is to start building those weapon systems. And they call them weapon systems, but the reality is they're satellites. And there's really four main satellites, and we'll talk about dinosaurs. So MIDAS, which is in the center there, is a missile defense alarm system. And the idea is that if we don't truly have an early warning system, like you can have radars, like the BMU systems that are looking over the North Pole, right, to kind of things that pick up rockets and aircraft flying over the North Pole. What if you had a satellite that is continually going over the Soviet Union and can pick up plumes of rocket launches or aircraft launching? That it gives you a much faster piece of intelligence. And that's MIDAS right there, right? And they have, these names sound awesome, but the reality is they just pick up a bunch of words and smash them together, right? So Missile Defense Alarm System. SAMOS is the Satellite and Missile Observation System. And you may kind of sense a trend going on here, right? Observation system, right? And SAMOS are these two systems here, right? Where you have, really think about, how many of you have heard of Corona? Not the beer, but the satellite, or Discoverer, or Keyhole, right? Corona is the first really photo intel satellite. This is a variation of Corona because Corona uses film, and it has to deposit its capsule, from the satellite, and it has to come back to Earth, and they have to snag it with a C-119 boxcar, and it's this really elaborate thing, right? Samos is the next generation of that, which is how can you use the same camera, or really a better camera, and rather than having to eject that canister back to Earth in these daring, unique ways of catching it midair, what if you could beam it back via radio or telegraph? Brilliant idea for 1957, by the way. One of the problems they run into is coding, that you only have a 3-minute window over the US to download your information. And the problem is, for the size of the photographs they want, they don't have enough time to download them, so they're losing resolution, and they're losing photographs. The other thing is they're not secure links. So anybody with a radio intercept or something can kind of pick up the stream and kind of download it themselves too. So they figure out that Samos may not work that well. They end up figuring out by the 1960s, but in 50s, they're working on it. TIROS is Television Infrared Observation System. It's a weather satellite. Yeah, they're not very creative with observation systems. They always just stick that on the end, right? It's a weather satellite. It looks down from space. It can give you good pictures of cloud formations, rain, hurricanes, that type of stuff. Now, there's one more that's not on here, but it's called Transit, which is the beginnings of what we know as GPS for navigation. And Transit is originally designed for ballistic missile submarines, because if you have this ballistic missile submarine, one of the things you need is a precise fix on where you are on the globe so you can get good data as you pick your target on the other side of the globe, and then you want to hit it in an accurate way. And the Loran systems and other things that they have in the 1950s are good, but not really good when you're underwater. And they figure out that if you can use a satellite-based navigation system, i.e. Transit, that you can get a more precise fix and therefore make your missiles more accurate. Now the last one, and everyone's favorite, is Dinosaur, or the X-20. Right? Now this is maybe where they get a little more creative, right? It stands for Dynamic Soaring Vehicle. And the idea is the Air Force is, we can build this system that looks like a space bomber, by the way, right? And if you can fly over your enemy in 10, 15 minutes, bomb them, return, awesome, right? But remember Eisenhower and that idea of militarization versus weaponization? Eisenhower says, no. We can't have any space bombers, by the way. And the Air Force says, okay, it's not a space bomber, it's a research vehicle. And they change the name from Dinosaur to X-20. And what they do, and again, a lot of this is just comical because we kind of know how it plays out, is that they say it's designed to research entering the atmosphere. I was like, okay, but we have some civilian programs that are playing with that same idea. No, this one's better because it can be reusable, which is true. And again, some of the early space shuttle stuff is going to come from this. Maybe if you know anything about lifting bodies, we did some research in the 60s, which is going to really generate ideas about a reusable shuttle. They all come from Dinosaur. But Dinosaur is going to be something the Air Force is going to hold on to into the Kennedy administration. And when it's canceled, they're going to come up with this manned orbital laboratory instead, which is, again, another way to get weapons in space. The Air Force is dead set on ensuring that the United States does not lose control of this frontier. However, the Eisenhower administration, and Eisenhower specifically, is really focused on ensuring that we aren't seen as weaponizing a new frontier. That he believes that prestige and using satellites for military purposes are a much greater benefit in the long run against the Soviet Union. So again, the idea, he's a fiscal conservative, so he doesn't want to just waste good money over bad. In fact, that Vanguard system, originally there's a plan for 12 satellites in the International Geophysical Year, so that's one satellite a month, which is significantly bold for the mid-1950s. Halfway through the program, they're about $3 billion over budget, and they want to scale it back. The Dulles brothers say no. Eisenhower says scale it back to 6. Eventually, it's going to be scaled back to 3. Because the reality is, you're wasting all kinds of money in for what? Okay? So what you see is this kind of branch of Eisenhower trying to hold the line of prestige and those original ideas identified by Rand, and the Air Force maintaining the idea that you have to control the high ground and you may have to not just militarize but also plan for the weaponization of space. And again, the whole time this debate is happening, The drumbeat within the Eisenhower administration is Vanguard's going to be launched by sometime late 1957, and we're going to be the first nation in space, and we will accrue that prestige. Until October 1957, right? Now, Sputnik is a big surprise, right? But it's not the huge surprise that everybody thinks it is. In fact, through early 57, right, through really the early winter and then spring, Allen Dulles, through National Security Council meetings, is giving prompt intelligence to Eisenhower that the Soviet Unions are testing a brand new ICBM called an R-7. And not only are they testing this new ICBM, but they're testing it with a dummy warhead on top, which weighs about 3 to 4 tons, by the way. And they postulate that if they can do that, they can surely put a satellite into space. But again, the American mantra is we're going to be first in space and gain all this prestige. So we know we're getting close, but the reality is the Soviets solved the thrust-to-weight ratio problem much earlier than we do. We're having problems with our rockets. The guidance systems tend to go haywire. The pressurization in the nozzles, which is pretty significant, by the way, have to be metallurgically perfect, and if they're not, they blow apart, which some of the early satellite launches are quite catastrophic and quite extravagant to watch because they just kind of go up in flames. So, in October 4th, 1957, the Soviets, on top of an R-7 ICBM, launch that Sputnik. All right. Now, most folks say, hey, it's the size of a basketball. It's really much bigger than that. It's about the size, yeah, you can see the guy's head, right? So it's probably like a big beach ball. And it really is, it's really just a radio transmitter inside 2 spheres. Like the inner sphere contains it with a battery pack. Most of that's taken up by a battery pack. And it has a radio transmitter that emits a beep. Like think of a truck backing up, right? Beep, 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 beep. That's all that it does. And those big things coming off the side are antenna, and then it's polished so that you can see it. So that second sphere is just really polished material so that you can see it as it goes through, because we're still working out tracking systems. Radar works, but they're not perfect yet. So if you have this highly polished surface, as the sun hits it, you can see it. And it creates a significant stir throughout not just the United States, but the globe, in the fact that we believe, and again, I would argue that the mantra from 46 on is we will be first, we will be first, we will be first, and then all of a sudden, what happens when you're not? And there's some international surveys that go out right after Sputnik that really ask people around the world, who's winning the Cold War? And most folks will come back and say, ooh, looks like the Soviet Union's doing it. Simply because they have this significant, seemingly scientific capability. Hold on. Well, this thing's touchy. Ooh, really touchy. However, Eisenhower has a different tack here. In fact, when Sputnik launches, Eisenhower makes the point to his staff, who are in an uproar. In fact, his press secretary, James Hagerty, is crafting a response. And he has this kind of really significant response about, yeah, don't worry, the United States is going to be second and ours is going to be better, and it's smaller and more, and it does all kinds of whiz-bang things. And Eisenhower says, I don't understand what the big deal is. All it is the Soviets solved a thrust-to-weight ratio problem prior to us. And oh, by the way, look at all of our other systems that we have. Remember that WS-117L? Those are starting to kind of mature and get to come online. That, yes, the Soviets have this beeping beach ball in space. But what we're looking at is navigation satellites, communication satellites, targeting satellites, photo reconnaissance satellites, things that the Soviets can't even think about, right? There's just beeps. Ours do all kinds of awesome things that we can leverage and use. And then it also has this idea, and again, you can see 117L right there, then NSC 58 14-4, which is the Air Force's obsession that if the Soviets beat you in space, what does that mean? They're going to control space. So 5814/1 is all about the Air Force doubling down again on, sir, you have to control space. You have to weaponize space. Eisenhower, to his credit, says, no, we don't. Now here's the Soviet space program, and hold that Eisenhower thought for 1 second. A month after Sputnik, they launched the first animal in space, Laika the dog. Laika doesn't make it back, because no one has solved the reentry problem yet, by the way. But still an impressive feat. By 61, they have the Zenit, which is their version of a photo reconnaissance satellite. Later in 61, or actually earlier in 61, they have Vostok. The first man in space is going to be a Soviet, Yuri Gagarin. And then by December 61, they're actually doing multi-tiered photo reconnaissance satellites as well. So the Soviets do have a capability. We just don't know about it until well after the Cold War, by the way. So back to Eisenhower, right? Really, the significance of Sputnik and its impact is prestige lost. And I would argue, yes, it is lost briefly, right? But it's only lost because I think we build it up so much that if you're the first, you get this great benefit. But the reality is, the way Eisenhower plays it in this slow, cool method, right? And one of the phrases he uses is, we're not in a 100-yard dash, we're in a mile-long run. We have to pace ourselves. And he says, why don't we develop this idea of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration? We already have this thing called NACA, which deals with aeronautics. What if we transform that organization and focused it on civilian space? And that way we can demonstrate to the world that not only are we not interested in controlling and weaponizing space, we are fixated on ensuring that space remains a free frontier for all to explore. Not a bad idea, right? He's also exploring Antarctica treaties and a bunch of other ideas, seabed treaties that help develop as well. So part of this is NASA is going to be a spin-off of really the impact of Sputnik, that it allows Eisenhower to double down on this idea of civilian uses of space. Now the reality, again, with NASA is NASA works very closely with the Department of Defense. And you may have heard the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs. There are also the first Mercury astronauts, I think the vast majority of them, not all of them, are former naval or Air Force aviators, right? Gemini program is going to have more of the same. There's also going to be a Blue Gemini program, which is a parallel project with Air Force. So this idea of, civilian, military, they're really one and the same with just that fine line. Remember when I talked about that missile, you scrub the name off, put a new name on? Now you scrub off U.S. Air Force and put on NASA, and it's civilian now. And Gemini will run some military programs or some military experiments in space. So there's this loose connection, but Eisenhower believes that because of Sputnik, right, you can play off that the Soviets are moving to weaponize space and control space because they're communists. We're interested in preserving space as a frontier for all to benefit, which is a unique element. And again, I have significant respect for Eisenhower because I think he's able to kind of push off the hysteria that Sputnik causes and maintain kind of a cool, calm head and say, no, we're about the long game, right? It's about understanding what the Soviets are doing, getting good intelligence, and playing that system. Now, all those systems at WS-117L are all black systems, by the way. And they get a huge bump when the U-2 was shot down on May 1st, 1960, that you don't have to lose pilots anymore and have egg on your face by saying, a weather aircraft, got lost. Now, if you have a satellite, no one can intercept it. So that's going to help benefit those programs that were started by the Air Force in the 1950s. Now, what you see on the other screen besides NASA is, up top is the first television photograph from space of weather. It's a Tyro system. You can see it's the Earth with some clouds. That's the fidelity of it. It's not really great, but it's something, right? Down from that is the Transit first navigation satellite, which is going to go online in 1965. And what the Navy develops relatively quickly is the little satellite that goes on top, which now collects electronic signatures. So it's not just a navigation satellite. Now the navigation satellite sits right on top here, and now it can collect radar signatures and all kinds of electronic elements. So what we're starting to do by the mid-60s now is not just navigation, but also stack civilian and military together in one package and use it for all kinds of awesome stuff. Now, Transit was originally designed for ballistic missile submarines, but Johnson's going to open it up for civilian aircraft and ships and all kinds of stuff. So it quickly becomes a civilian program. The map you see of the world up here is the first corona passes. So those black elements are the photographic arcs that the first corona, which is photographic, it shoots pictures and then deposits a big capsule back to space. That's its first mission, first successful mission, and that first successful mission actually takes more pictures of the Soviet Union than all the U-2 flights combined. And you didn't have to risk any pilot. You didn't have to lie about flying over someone else's country. In fact, one of the other benefits of Sputnik, Eisenhower was pushing for this open skies idea that you were allowed to fly over each other's countries and see what they had to kind of keep everything cool and collected. when Sputnik is launched and it's about to kind of fly over the United States, one of the discussions with in the State Department is, do we protest that it's flying over our airspace? And Eisenhower says, no, it's space, it's for the benefit of all, and that sets the tone for them. Now we can use spy satellites, the same thing, and they can't protest because we didn't say anything about Sputnik. So again, Eisenhower's calm, cool, collected head is, I think, significant in the fact that Sputnik is a catalyst and a major turning point, but it doesn't allow us to spin off into this racing idea. Now, the last one is a favorite of mine. This little thing down here is a car, right here. It's a car, right? This is a big Mylar balloon, and it's the first communication satellite. And what happens is they get launched in something like transit, and then it's inflated in space, and then you just bounce your radio signals off of it. It's a passive communication satellite. So if you buy your kids, grandkids, significant others a Mylar balloon in the supermarket, it stems from the first passive communication satellite. Now later we have repeater satellites, which is the next stage, like Project SCORE, where we have a Christmas message being broadcast to the world from Eisenhower. But this is the first one. So by 1961, really space, I would argue, is already militarized. We're using it for those main purposes that we saw defined in 1946. NASA is up and running, not just Mercury, but also we're moving towards Gemini, then eventually Apollo. And there's a hard line between militarization and weaponization. And with that, I'll take your questions. I have some recommended readings up there. Yeah, let's go one and two, right?
I think I saw briefly a mention of Vanguard. Wasn't it a Navy program?
It was a Navy
program. And as a
program.
kid, I remember watching it go a couple times.
Yeah, like 6 or 7 times, right? It's a Navy program, but then it becomes a civilian scientific program, right? And that's, what's interesting is Eisenhower is so steadfastly committed to this separation of civilian and military, but the reality is it's not a gap like this, the gap's like this. So yeah, it is a Navy program that the Navy can't do because they're running out of money, so they kick it over to NASA and other.
Inter-service rivalry, Navy beat Army football game stuff.
Yeah, no, again, part of Eisenhower's idea with NASA and then DARPA, right, which is really an advanced research think tank within DOD. DARPA spins off of this too, and he says, all you guys are competing with one another. That's why we're losing, by the way. So the Navy has a program, the Army has a program, the Air Force has a program. If we had one national program, it would be up in space already. So what he does is he takes all those programs initially and gives them to DARPA, and like WS-117, that was given to DARPA, and the Air Force is kind of dejected, and then within a year they have it all back.
And wasn't the Vanguard basically an ICBM on top of on top of an ICBM, an Atlas?
Yeah, in fact, all the early satellites are put up, and they're not ICBM. I mean, they're really just rocket boosters. I mean, and so we play this fine line between, is it an ICBM or a rocket booster? Well, it's a rocket booster if it's used for civilians, and it has something Pacific and technological on top. If it has an atomic warhead on top, it's an ICBM.
Thanks.
Which is, you have to have, definitions. It's not a bad definition, right?
Yes, sir. My question's a two-part question. This is a counterfactual. Let's assume there's no Cold War to speak of, no real foreign threat. Do you believe we would have gone to the moon without the threat or the Cold War threat? And the second part of my question is, do you think the fact that we're talking about going back to the moon and on to Mars is based on the fact that it seems like the Cold War is heating up? In your opinion, is those two facts?
Let me start with a quick story about the moon. So as I was doing a bunch of research at NASA, I found a letter that Eisenhower wrote to Kennedy when Kennedy made his famous speech about, by the end of this decade, we're going to send a man to the moon, right?
Right.
The letter essentially said, "Are you nuts, man? Right? You know how much money you're going to waste on this?" And he calls them space stunts. Like, don't get involved in these space stunts. Like, again, back to the idea of you're in a mile. Like, keep your pace, focus on what we want to achieve. Don't get involved in space stunts, because Eisenhower sees it as, what do we get out of it? which you do get a lot of scientific and engineering things, but the reality is, can you use that money for better? So I don't know. If there's no Cold War, I don't know. I would like to think yes, because it's there and we tend to be kind of inquisitive to begin with, and satellites are part of the structure, whether it's military or not, right? V2s are already going to be built. So I would like to think there's some inquisitive minds that would like to say, hey, can we get to that thing glowing in the sky at night? Maybe, right? There may not be the same impetus for it, though. Because again, I think it's driven by this idea of prestige. That if you can get to the moon, that idea of demonstrating technology that you have that your enemy doesn't is significant. And I think that's when we win the space race.
The point I'd make is when the last man on the moon was in, I believe, 1972, I was still in high school. And you can see I'm not exactly young. We stayed away from the moon as far as manned for 50 years. Now we're talking about going back, and that's a long time. 50 years is a long time.
True.
The point is, now that the Cold War seems to be heating up again, you could argue that it was basically we did what we did because we had to. It's like our ancestors come to the United States, not really because they wanted to, they had to because of Europe in such horrible shape. But the impetus for a threat was paramount or not, and that's just
Yeah, no, I would argue that part of this lecture, right, is about the military right now is obsessed with, domains, military domains, and space is one of them. And the idea that if other folks are exploring space and moving towards weaponization, you have to do the same so you're not left behind. So I think that's part of the idea of driving the moon, but also the idea that we haven't done it in almost 2 generations, right? So is there some benefit to demonstrate again the abilities of your nation to do science, technology, and engineering, that you are advanced and you will share that data with the world, which I think has some benefit. Again, I don't think the Eisenhower idea has ever really gone away. It got suppressed after the 70s, but NASA has always maintained that idea that, you have these dreams and you have the capabilities and you have engineers who can do these wonderful things. They just take sometimes decades, if not multiple decades. You.
I have some commentary, and then I have questions.
Okay,
I grew up in a little town south of Kansas City, down between Harrisonville and Clinton. That in the 60s became a big missile field, an enormous missile field.
Right.
I was wondering how many people ever drove to the lake down 7 Highway from Harrisonville to Clinton. Well, we believed that the highway had these concrete edges on it. If you ever drive down that, they were pretty dangerous, and we believed that they cut those edges off so that they could haul the missiles down the highway because it was too big to just with those edges on it. So this is where I grew up, and it's a big deal.
yeah. Now this whole area, the Midwest, is all missile ranges and
The
bomber
second
bases.
comment is, General Carlos LeMay, you mentioned him at the start of this. He was a bomber kind of guy. And I grew up with this idea of the Cold War, that General Carlos LeMay took over things and he built these B-52s. I think it was B-29s in the...
It starts with B-29s, B-50s,
And he built
B-36s,
B-52s,
B-47s,
and
yeah.
we built these air bases across the north part of America, and we built NORAD. I think it was. I'm not a military.
We built Strategic Air Command, which is
Yeah.
the structure, and then
we expected the
NORAD, which is
Russians
different, right.
to send a bunch of bombers over here, and we were going to knock them down, and we were safe.
that was the idea in the
That was
early
the idea.
50s.
But they didn't take the bait.
Well, no, actually, they did have the capabilities, and this is part of that idea about
They
intelligence,
said,
right?
We're not going to make it there. We're going to build missiles.
No, actually, they built a fair number of bombers in the mid to late 50s, but the problem, remember that bomber gap that gets talked about? The problem with the bomber gap is we really don't know what they have, simply because of the lack of intelligence.
In 1957, my dad, who was a Mennonite, still had the the interest in this subject to take us to Kansas City, and we watched a movie about Sputnik we're all afraid because
It's
the
it's height of
Russians
Cold
weren't
War.
coming in airplanes that we could knock down. They were coming in.
Yeah, no,
That's
and
what the story was.
Yeah, no, and that's part of that impetus for intelligence, that if you don't know, you have to fear the worst.
And
right?
but that's what the military, that's what the government put out was.
Some elements of the government put that out.
Yeah, there were
others,
these movies.
There were other, like the Dulles Brothers are all about that line, yeah.
My Baptist church preacher took us out in the field, just down here, and showed us a movie and we watched Sputnik going across. And my question, I'll stop now.
Okay.
Is there a triad now?
Yes, yeah,
And are the B-52s still flying?
yes. They're much different B-52s, and they're about to be re-engined. So yes, there's a triad. And satellites are still significantly part of that triad for targeting, navigation, and communication, by the way.
I have an institutional question.
Okay.
We have the new Space Force. Do they have an historical section? You may or may not know that. I was just thought I could ask you that.
Do they have it? Not yet, because they're too new, but they're borrowing a lot of stuff from the Air Force. So it's
Right, and
mainly
they're gonna
Air
split
Force
it off from
historians.
that?
Yeah, and it's splitting off. So the reality is, if you're looking at like the history of the militarization of space, you kind of start with 46-ish, ran this stuff, and then Space Force is going to end up with their own unique elements.
I'll
So-
study STI
yeah.
and
Yep, absolutely, right. And each branch has their own space component too, though. So like Space Command isn't new. I think the first Space Command is in like the late 60s, early 70s.
I think it's 19 is when the Space Force came in.
Yeah, but Space Force is its own unique branch like the Air Force. So the idea that space is now an operational domain, Space Force then codifies that. But part of my argument is it's nothing new. We've been playing with space as a military domain since 1946, I would argue. So it just took us a while to get there.
Well, they may come to you for some knowledge about the subject.
We'll see. I work for the
Thank you.
Army though, so I'm kind of happy there too. So
John, I think we'll finish up with this question.
Sure,
And then
absolutely.
can you stick around if people have a couple more?
absolutely, I can stick around.
Thank you.
My question is, to what extent do you think the U.S.'s inability to master heavy lifting in the early years led to the development of microprocessors and miniaturization that we experience today?
You know, it is. It's significant. And in fact, right after Sputnik, after Sputnik 2 and Laika goes up, the Soviets, who want to twist the knife a little bit into us, they send a diplomatic cable to the United States and say, hey, how would you guys like to partner with us in a space program, and we'll put a joint satellite up. And on the surface, it looks like a good idea. So, the Cold War coming together and, getting over our differences. Eisenhower and others are like, no, simply because, technology, it's microprocessing and like microelectronics that we're actually well ahead where the Soviets are. Laika and those Zenit satellites are mainly designed with vacuum tubes and kind of like really radio technology, essentially. We are moving from radio technology to computer and electronic technology, and we don't want them to get that. So, yeah, absolutely. Which is another whole story, by the way, on how that whole system develops. Yes. So thank you. I appreciate it. I'll stick around if you have any additional questions or comments.